as it is the custom, I always say, Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed.
Why do we say that all the time? We said that since the day I think I've been here. Is always say that statement. There's always a response to that, and I always wondered about that statement. It's always kind of puzzled me as to why we say it, because I guess the implications to that is that we say he's risen indeed, that Jesus somehow conquered death, right? By raising from the grave. And that's great, you know. I think the closer I get to death, the more I appreciate what goes on under the side of this life, which is, who knows when that will be, but it's getting here quicker by the second. I tell you that right now. But also wonder about today. While my heart is still beating, what does this Easter experience say to us even today? Because I don't know about you, that I'm not so much into the conquering death as it is I am in conquering life. You know what I mean? There's so much about my life, my issues, my problems, my flaws, my addictions, my weaknesses, that just reminds me that I'm so far away from conquering life. And it always seems to be in the front part of my life every single day. So how does Easter help me? How does Easter help us try to conquer life today, tomorrow, next week, the weeks to come, all the way down the road? And I think in all actuality, when I think about Easter, I think Easter really is God's response to what took place on the Friday before. That's the day when God's own people, right, made the choice to kill God's own son. Just kind of let that sink in just for a minute. I know we talked about this story in the past, but just let that sink in. Just think about what that would look like. Maybe even put yourselves in that situation if somebody took your precious children that you know and they murdered them. How would you respond to that? Would you respond to that in the same way that God responded? I would say no. And I think here lies the fundamental conflict with our faith right here. Because we would really prefer the God that we have in this relationship to respond to others the way that we would respond to them, right? While God, on the other hand, would prefer that we respond to people the way that God responds to people. So from that Friday when God's people killed God's only son, and the earth turned dark and eerie, and the world waited for God to respond to this selfish act of us. The question is, how is God going to respond? What will God do to God's very own people that God created? People who are filled with flaws and addictions and selfish tendencies that are capable of giving life as well as destroying life. What would God do? Well, this is Easter, so we kind of know the story. God chose to love, right? God chose to forgive. God also chose to empower us. God chose to give us the very spirit of the one that we killed. God has given us the ability to love perfectly in spite of our ability to hate and to destroy. And if we choose to follow this God, then what we are choosing to do is to learn to develop into the person that loves and forgives, is empowered by Christ's Spirit to love perfectly. Make no bones about it, Christianity is extremely demanding faith. It's not soft. It's not flowery. It's not about being nice. It's a very demanding faith. And I want us to consider words that Jesus spoke in the 10th chapter of Matthew. Let's look at this a little at a time. First thing he said is this. This might catch you a little off guard. Don't think that I've come to bring peace on earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. Happy Easter, people. It's really not probably what you expected to hear this morning, right? But these are some words that are very challenging to us. They're very words that we don't really expect to come from the Prince of Peace, but we want to make something very clear. Jesus did come to bring a message of peace. However, to live as one of his followers causes a war, a conflict, if you will, that takes place within us. Jesus did not come to bring violence, as some would apply this to mean. He came instead to bring life. But this life also contradicts the life of our impulses. Think about that for a minute. Because this is the struggle that we have almost every day with our souls. It's a battle over who we will listen to, who we will trust, who we choose to follow. Will we trust our impulses? Will we trust our feelings? Will we trust our own wisdom? Or are we going to trust the voice of the very one who created us? That's the conflict, because those are two completely different voices. Because our impulses say things that we want to hear, right? Our impulses say, give me, feed me, do for me. I don't have enough. But the voice of our soul always says, feed others, give to others, do for others, because there is plenty. And so it's this battle with our mind, over our mind and our hearts, that's just described as a war that's taking place within us, a conflict that never ends. That we are asked to deny ourselves and our impulses and take the side of Jesus, even when there are those who say we should not. Because Jesus doesn't stop here at the harsh words. He goes on, he says this. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against his mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. How does that make you feel, huh? How does that make you feel to hear those words? Those are harsh words. They're hard words. Because the struggle of our faith is not only something that comes in from within us, it's also something that carries over in personal lives. Because the most controlling entity in the world is what? Our family. More specifically, me, parents. That can be the most controlling entity in the world. When I was in Bright Divinity School, my dean was Dean Suggs, Jack Suggs. We used to call him the Bear. I think we called that in front of him too. He was a tough old guy, but he was a contemporary of my grandfather. My grandfather was a regional minister back in the day, and when Jack was in TCU, an undergraduate department, majoring in business, he was going to go into the family business. His family was big, I just heard, in the church in Henderson, Texas, in East Texas. And so they grew there, and then he was going to go off and go into school and start over with the family business, take over for the family business. Well, my granddaddy took a liking to Jack, saw a lot of qualities in him, and as my granddaddy's responsibility was to kind of fill pulpits within the region itself in the state of Texas back then. And so he saw Jack, and he said, hey, I got this church I want you to go preach to. Just see if you like it. So we sent him off to go preach. Well, 1 week turned to 2, then 3, then 4. Next thing you know, Jack found himself in a position where he thought, this is where I need to be. And so from that point, he changed his major to religion, and he decided not to go and to follow his parents' lead, which was fantastic for everybody except his parents, right? They were livid, not only with Jack, but more so with my grandfather. And the day my granddad, or that family died, they still were just so angry with my granddaddy for tearing apart the family, for tearing apart the family business at that. When Jack reads these very words, he understands where Jesus is coming from. He will tell you the meanings of these words, and he even tells this story even 60 years after that event, as he did to our class. Every time he tells it with a tear in his eye. It's not how God envisions life to be, but because we are humans, The point is to be prepared if you choose to go in the direction of God, that it will tear apart those who wish to control your fate. That's just how we tend to be. Again, it's not God's wish or desire, but when it comes to choosing God over other gods that live in our lives, things get ugly. They can get ugly. As it's experienced whenever Jesus came in and was tearing the family apart as well. And then Jesus follows up with this statement that I think is the most powerful statement that he says. He says this, "Whoever does not take up his cross, up the cross and follow me, is not worthy of me. Those who will find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." I want you to see a little bit up here. I want you to read this for me again. I want you to notice that nowhere up there does Jesus say, I want you to wear a cross or display a cross and then follow me. He says, I want us to take up your cross. Take it up and let's go. It's always a big question, is that what does it mean to take up our cross? I always liked Henry Nouwen's translation of what that means. Henry Nouwen defines our crosses in many ways. He says this, the cross that we have is hard enough for us. We all have a cross, but are we willing to take it up? Are we willing to accept it as our cross? Our cross may be simple. It may be that we just can't study. It may be that we are handicapped. It may be that we suffer from depression. It may be that we experience conflict in our families. It may be that we're victims of violence or victims of abuse. It may be that we suffer from some form of addiction. We didn't choose any of it, but these things are our crosses. We can ignore them. We can reject them. We can refuse them. We can hate them all we want. But we can also take up those crosses and follow Jesus with them. To me, this is the real message of Easter. This is what makes sense to me. Because God does not make us perfect simply by going to church. But we have been given this ability to love people perfectly. God doesn't take away our crosses, but He gives us the ability to do great things with our lives in spite of our crosses. We are flawed. We will not ever be able to remove those flaws from our lives. But God can take our flaws and help us use them so that we can have a greater appreciation for life, more compassion for our brothers and sisters whose crosses are just too heavy to bear at this time. Jesus tells us to take up our cross, not to hide it, not to ignore it, not to pretend we don't have it, not to criticize or judge other people because of their crosses, but to take up our cross. Take it up, follow Jesus, serve others, and do great things in spite of the crosses we bear. To live this way is really, to me, what it means to proclaim that Christ has risen. Christ has risen today. Meditate on these words.